Hi, thank you so much, everyone, for coming and joining us today. This is quite the event. I've never done a virtual conference before, and I want to thank everyone, including Mitchell Baker, for coming and joining us today. This is really exciting. And of course, if you have any questions or comments, yeah, I think you can put them directly into the chat window. And more importantly, thank you to everyone for staying home and not exposing yourself to anyone or anyone to you. And if there's anyone who is anxious or scared or feels like they have a cold, we are thinking of you and really appreciate you staying home. So I'm going to be interviewing today. My name is Charles Duhigg. I'm a reporter at the New Yorker magazine and the author of a couple books. And I'm going to be visiting today with Mitchell Baker, who's the chairwoman and interim CEO of Mozilla. And Mitchell, you've spent your whole career fostering the not-for-profit ethic in the internet and among tech companies, and also fighting for an open and free and democratized web. And I was wondering if you could just take a couple of minutes just to tell us about changed.
Let's see, that's a broad question. So maybe I'll get started, and if I wander too far, you pull me back, because there's a long history there. I would say in the early days, Mozilla, which goes way back to the turn of the century, or the turn of the millennium, I guess we called it. But the early piece that gave Mozilla really power was a sense that something needed to be done, and that it just wasn't happening out in the world, and that we, the set of people of us who happened to be close to the early internet technology, we had some set of skills and some ability to see what should be. And so that conviction, I think, is easy to underestimate, especially when you get big, as Mozilla has, and you have some set of employees. But even today, I would say the conviction of what we're trying to do and our shared sense, both of purpose, but of some better state that we're trying to create, is actually the most powerful thing. And it sustained us, in the times when we were small and no one knew and no one cared about us. I think it helped us stay, who we are, Mozilla, in the times of big success. And it's also, I think, guiding us right now in a time of what's really transformation for Mozilla, and how to have more impact on the big problems today.
And how big are you guys now?
Oh, that depends on how you count. We're, employees about 1,100. So okay. Pretty big. So giant for a nonprofit. Giant for someone trying to make something better, especially, but tiny in the tech space.
Yeah.
So, our annual revenues, I think, are like maybe about, it varies a little bit, but about 400 million. So giant for a nonprofit, and tiny compared to Google or Facebook or Apple or Amazon.
And what do you spend most of your time thinking about and working on now, both for the company as a whole, but also your personal time as the interim CEO?
Yeah. Well, we're as I said, it's a time of transformation for Mozilla, where we are reorient ourselves very squarely back into the question of how to fix the internet, or how to make an internet that's better, how to make an internet that's not just open and distributed, but that provides a human experience that's worth having. So how is it decent? How do you have some discourse? How do you figure out like what's verifiable, or what counts as a fact? And so we've spent some time, especially as the phone system has become so dominant, where it's hard to have our core product, Firefox. A lot of time for a while thinking about that, and now we've just decided, look, that's the way life is. There's a lot of problems that need to be fixed. We have a set of assets. How do we change Mozilla, set up, you'd call them, innovation hubs? What are the new products that matter? And the state of mind for that is, it's not about us. It's not about Mozilla sustaining itself. As soon as you get some success, there's that tendency to want to keep it, whether it's revenue or employees or impact, and so we're very explicitly not about right now, trying to sustain ourselves or keep ourselves, but very much about how do we actually solve some problems and figuring, like, if I could, just like so much of the tech industry, that the way you sustain yourself will come if you actually have a product and offerings that people want. Like that's the fundamental thing. So both for myself, in the current role, but also the organization.
And I want to ask you about that. And I'll just mention to those tuning in, I can actually see all your chats. So if you have questions or if you have thoughts, but let me ask before that, why not for profit? Obviously, you guys, I mean, you have a lot of revenues. You're a big company. You've had products that at various points have been some of the dominant products. Why not do what you are trying to do as a for-profit company?
I'd say there's two main reasons. And, I'm a believer that you get the sort of things that you incent people to do. And this came out of working in the tech industry, before the internet. And that, in that case, it was a joke about the sales force. In the days, every piece of software used to be sold. And a lot of them were expensive, especially the software you sold into the enterprise. It would be, extremely expensive. And so there was always a sales force. Every tech company had a sales force that, had quotas and we're trying to meet them. And so it turns out that the way you wrote the quota plan was incredibly important, because the salespeople would find every single loophole in it and every way to maximize their revenue. I mean, makes sense, right? That's their job. They get paid on sales. And so you would find quirks in the sales plan that you had no idea were there when you wrote them, but because people are smart and can respond to incentives. So I think that's a very powerful force for humanity. We're very creative. And so I feel that being a for-profit has a bunch of advantages, but it is incenting for the financial return of a set of shareholders, which are by definition small and not the public. And that incentive is very real. And so it's okay, to be a for-profit, but you have to, I think, recognize the incentive. You can't pretend that incentive to maximize the financial return for your shareholders isn't there. And right. That will affect what you do.
So this is a great question, because I think when there is a clarity that comes from being for-profit, right, which is exactly what you just said, it's not necessarily the best for the world, but when you wake up every day, ultimately who you are accountable to and who you ought to be serving. But for a not-for-profit, it's a broader question, which is great for society. And I know that as Mozilla has grown, you guys have spent time thinking about the different communities that you ought to serve. And sometimes those communities come into conflict. I guess two questions. First of all, how frequently do you go back to your mission statement, update your mission statement, think about whether the mission is the right one for today? And then how do you parse out who that mission ought to be serving and prioritize the different groups that have a legitimate claim on what you're doing?
Okay, there's a lot in there. And let me just dive back and finish on the last one to say, individuals do make a difference. So I do think you can have a for-profit which has this incentive, this financial incentive, and mitigate it, and do lots of good things in the world. I think individuals with high integrity and determination can do that, but I don't think it's sustainable over time.
Interesting.
People get tired and new people come in. So I think there are, to be very clear, for-profit organizations out there where the people involved in them are trying their best and making hard decisions and working against the incentives. Right. And so, if you're in one of those, like, good for you. I just think it's very hard to sustain that over time. Right.
Yeah.
That the incentives of the system will push. And in a funny way, the more successful you are, the harder it gets. Because the more successful that you are, the more you have shareholders, the more they expect a return, the more the system pressures you. And so I think over time, it's hard to sustain. But there are, it is quite possible to do great things. And so I want to be clear about that. Okay, on to your other question, a little bit about the mission and who we serve. Well, Mozilla has I'd say the benefit and the challenge that our mission is very broad. And the manifesto, it's called the Mozilla Manifesto. And it started with 10 principles, and 18 months or a few years ago, we added another 4 to get to the human experience I talked about. And so that actually is a driving force inside the organization. And in fact, the new publication protocol, they did their inaugural issue recently, which was had a big piece about Mozilla. And the reporter there said, every single person I talked to inside your org quoted the manifesto to me. Every single person inside a tech org. I've never had that happen before. And I will say that every consultant that we ever have says the same thing. Like when we launched a really much more aggressive diversity and inclusion program, we got some help from some consultants, and they came back and said the same thing. Like everyone in your organization is aligned on the manifesto. So that's great. But it's also very broad, right? And it really covers, like, we want an internet that has this set of traits in it. And so it's great for getting people focused on it, and that's what drives us, but it's so broad, it could capture almost anything. And it's not clear about, what's the audience and so on. And I will say that's changed over time. And when Mozilla started, we actually didn't start as a consumer product. We were the technology back end at the time for Netscape and then AOL, who weren't particularly interested in a consumer product coming out of Mozilla. So we started with a very developer system focus, moved to a consumer product piece, and have been mostly a consumer product org for quite a while, and are now, as part of this transformation, considering that as well. Another piece that's changed, if I might, is to say that right now, especially since our mission has been explicitly broadened to include human experience, options available for anyone, like where demographics don't matter. like that's the first edition. Civil discourse, decency, fact. That our audience increasingly includes what you would call allies. What are other organizations and people working for those sets of things, many of whom are nonprofits or social enterprises of one sort or another. And so our audience is currently broadening, we hope anyway, where Mozilla can be more of a participant in many of the activities or movements or social good, or global good kind of efforts underway, because technology is, the underlying technology can make things better or worse.
That's interesting, and I want to plunge more into that. With tactics are effective. Let me ask something that's come up in the comments. A question that a couple of people have asked, including Rekha Pai, and I totally apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name. But Rekha was asking, what about hybrid structures? What about public benefit corporations? How does that fit into when you think about incentives? Is that a path that you think is as usable as not-for-profits, or?
I think the movement towards hybrid structures is incredibly important. In the long run, I think our whole corporate system needs to change. Corporate law. Corporate law comes probably from the late 1800s and the early phase of industrialization. So it needs a bunch of changes. And so I see the current hybrid as early phases in that, and good steps forward, but I anticipate much more. So some set of hybrids, you're able in your charter documents to set out goals other than financial return to your shareholders. So that's a good thing. And it's odd that it would be necessary, but there was this school of thought that it was a breach of fiduciary duty for a director to consider anything other than the financial return to shareholders. So a very extreme version of corporate law with no accountability to your environment and your employees. Like, kind of amazing to think that was mainstream, but it has been mainstream in the United States. So like undoing that is necessary. And so the hybrids are really quite good for that. And then I think over time we'll see, I think, some will end up, some intentionally, maybe more towards going towards profit and then the use of the returns, and others will stick closer to the mission, because that comes up a lot. And I've heard that even at Mozilla. It's not something I subscribe to, but it's the train of thought that says it's kind of okay, like whatever we do, like that's fine, and especially if we make a lot of money at it, because then we can use the money for social benefit purposes. And
that's interesting.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying that's interesting.
Yeah, and it sort of makes sense, and there are a bunch of sort of social benefit organizations that will run a quote for-profit business just to make revenue, which they can then spend for their mission.
Yeah.
So that's one model, and I think it's fine. It's not Mozilla's model. We are not trying to make as much money as we can out of Firefox, so someplace else we can do something good. We see that in our case, anyway, our products are the way we make our mission real. And so we try to do the balancing of how do you make consumer demand in the marketplace, which is competitive, with how do you build, how close can you get to what we think is the ideal product for social benefit? And that's tricky.
And that's really inspiring, because I think that gets to this tension of, so let me ask you this. So I'm sure many people who are tuning in, they are revolutionaries. They want to be revolutionaries. They want to bring the revolution to the streets. Well, maybe not to the streets today or in the next 2 or 3 weeks, but soon to the streets. And I think the question is, when we are living in this culture where capitalism is the prevailing ethic, where we simply have to look around, particularly in technology, particularly in the Valley, so many things are judged, whether founders want to admit it or not, by how many dollars you've collected and what your exit strategy looks like, as opposed to how many lives you're genuinely changing. As someone who's spent your life devoted to the idea of the free and open internet, even when there are so many large corporations trying to limit that, what are the tactics that the audience should be thinking about in order to become effective members of the Rebel Alliance that keep democracy and the internet free?
Yeah, well, I can give some examples, but of course it'll only be a sliver, and there are others. I'll just go back to where I started, where I think conviction is really key. At Mozilla, it's an odd piece because you started with revolution and revolution in the streets, and we actually try at Mozilla to be a little more central than that. I'm born and raised in Oakland and Berkeley, not of the '60s. I'm not that old, but of that ethic, and so it's interesting. I'll tell you what I try not to become a zealot. I am very distrustful of zealots. Because I think humanity, it's easy for human beings to be hypocritical. And just so often it seems when you find people who have very rigid rules and everything is harsh and everything is black and white and there's only one true way, and if you don't believe it, you're a heretic and it's okay whatever happens to you. Like typically those rules don't apply to the person making them or to the inner group. So I've tried to avoid zealotry because I think hypocrisy is a difficult way to build social good. Sorry, I just there was one other piece in there. Mozilla, we have a pretty deep community-based culture, and I find that is important in keeping to the path, because once, especially as you get to be successful, once you have a lot of employees, or once there's revenue in the mix, right, then you have a different set of issues. There's success conditions. But they're quite real, because if you have employees and you have salary, you have a lot of tools to get people to do what the leader or management or whomever wants, and those, but when you have a set of volunteers who are spending their time and energy because they believe something, they have a different sense of staying to the core. Now, that can be difficult to manage, right? Like especially. If you have a few active volunteers, but having some diverse perspective on what's the balance between practicalities of life and the mission is really important. And for us volunteer communities, could I just add one last?
Sure, absolutely.
And that was the piece on capitalism. Oddly enough, like I'm not on the far extreme about capitalism, mostly because I think the real problem is human nature. And if it doesn't, to me, at least when my limited but some experience with history, and like all societies, the people, the elites in the center gather resources to themselves, right? And human nature, unless you have a really healthy society, human nature will go bad and accumulate unacceptable amounts of resources in the center. So if you look at societies that don't call themselves capitalist now, or in the past, or feudal or monarchical, like all societies do this. And so I think there's capitalism as an economic system, and then there's, of course, you add human nature in it, and then you add sort of unbridled, when you get to a form of capitalism where you have this unbridled ability of people to accumulate too much into themselves. Clearly that's a problem, but I'm not sure that getting rid of capitalism fixes it. Right.
Like I absolutely agree. Yeah. So we're almost out of time. Let me ask just one question really briefly. I mean, I think in many ways for folks who are tuning in today, Mozilla is the model of what they hope to become, right? 1,100 people, a huge impact. It's been almost 20 years now that you guys have been around. And I imagine that as you've grown and as the world has changed, there has been these struggles with trying to keep the culture real, like trying to communicate it to not only your volunteers, but your employees. What's the one big tip you have for folks as they grow and as they change about making sure that they don't lose that culture and that they still live it every day?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to respond from both having some successes and not enough success, I think it's the biggest place where I wish I'd had a role model, and figuring out, because a great culture is ambient. Lots of times, you know it and you feel it, and how it is to get that out and expressed and modeled very explicitly. And so I'm increasingly trying to do more of that. So I would say finding some, I call them handles, but means that people use to express the culture is really useful. And then the second thing is to get some outside perspectives and see how they describe things. Like we had an outside person come, at an event once, a speaker, and he had a phrase, the old guard and the new guard, and lots of experiences about it. And we realized that described a cultural split for us. And then I think the biggest learning that I've had is that we worked very hard so that newcomers could feel core to the project, and that you didn't have to be there in 2000 or, pre-Firefox or whatever it was to really belong. But when we did that, we de-emphasized what really made success in the early days and what it felt like. And we didn't convey that enough. So we worked really hard not to have the old guard be the only thing that mattered, but we didn't work hard enough at the things that we felt and how to get them expressed and modernized.
That's interesting. Well, thank you so much for taking some time to visit with us, and thank you to the audience for bearing with us as we learn how to use the system. And keep up the good fight. I really appreciate you sharing with us.
Well, thank you, and let me express the same sentiment to the audience and to the set of people out there who are spending lives and energy and focus trying to improve things for all of us. It's extremely gratifying. I mean, I don't mean that in a like I'm responsible. I mean, like motivating for the future.
Right.
For us.
No, absolutely. Have a great day. Thanks, Mitchell.